They thought the night watch at the ranger station would be uneventful, just wind through the pines and the distant cry of an owl. But then out of the fog, a colossal black horse emerged, scarred and heaving, dragging a torn canvas sack behind it. It didn't run, it didn't rage. It lowered itself as if pleading eyes fixed on the humans with a desperate intelligence. And when the rangers untied the sack to see what the beast had carried across the frozen wilderness, what they found inside left them stunned and set in motion a chain of events no one could have imagined. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe. The mountains of Bridger Teton in winter were not forgiving. Snow dusted the ground in a thin, icy crust that crackled under boots and hooves alike, and the air carried a damp chill that seeped through seams and joints no matter how tightly a coat was drawn. Fog moved low between the pines, heavy with the breath of the marshlands, coiling around the tree trunks like restless ghosts. The wind threaded through the forest, with a mournful voice whistling as it bent the tops of the evergreens and made the brittle branches slap against one another. Somewhere far off, an owl called once, then silence reclaimed the valley. The ranger station crouched in the middle of that silence like a lone island. Its walls, built of thick pine logs, groaned under the cold. Outside, a single lantern swung from the porch beam, throwing a small golden circle of light that seemed pitiful against the dark swell of the forest. The glow barely touched the edge of the snow and was quickly swallowed by the fog beyond, as though the night were actively smothering it. Inside the station, Claire Dawson was on watch. Claire was 32 years old, tall and spare in her build, the kind of figure that had grown lean from long miles, walked on rough ground. Her face carried the weathered bronze of sun and wind, but her features had a strength that drew attention, an angular jaw, steady hazel eyes, lips set in a line that hinted at both discipline and restraint. Her hair, a dark chestnut, was bound tightly under a knit cap, a few stray strands brushing her cheek. She had been a soldier once, before she chose the quieter uniform of the Ranger Service. Years in the military had drilled into her the habits of order and vigilance, but they had also left shadows. She knew what loss felt like, what silence followed when comrades were carried off the field. That knowledge lived in her eyes, even when her mouth tried to smile. Now she lived among the pines, serving in a small ranger outpost that most people in the valley passed by without noticing. She was used to solitude, used to nights like this, where the world outside pressed in so tightly it seemed the station itself might vanish into the fog. She sat at the wooden desk by the front window, writing a line in the weather log with gloved fingers before setting down her pencil. The small radio beside her hissed with weak static, a distant voice cutting in and out as it broadcast routine chatter from the main office miles away. Her coffee, poured an hour ago, had already gone cold. She took a sip anyway, grimaced at the bitter chill, and muttered under her breath, "Should have brought the thermos." On most nights, she didn't mind the quiet. She'd pace the porch, note the wind direction, sometimes catch sight of deer moving along the tree line. She had learned to hear the subtleties in the forest, the difference between the snap of a twig under a hare's foot and the sharper crack of something larger. Tonight, though, there was something different. She felt it before she could name it, a tensing in her chest, a sense that the silence outside wasn't rest, but pause, like the whole forest was holding its breath. She rose from her chair and slipped on her heavy coat, pushing open the door. The hinges groaned softly. Stepping onto the porch, she squinted into the fog. Her boots sank half an inch into the crusted snow, and her breath rose in white plumes that curled and vanished into the air. The lantern at her back threw her shadow long and thin across the porch boards. She descended the steps, slowly scanning the tree line. The only sound was the wind combing through the pines. Her eyes darted, searching for movement. Nothing. She exhaled and shook her head. Still unease lingered. She paced along the wooden porch, the rhythm of her boots steady her flashlight, beam cutting shallow arcs into the mist. She felt small out here, a single figure against the enormous dark. For a moment, she thought again of her army days, the way patrols in foreign deserts had felt every grain of sand, whispering every shadow a possible threat. That same instinct now prickled along her skin. Then she saw it. At first, it was only a distortion in the fog, a shape where there should have been none. A darker darkness moving steadily between the trees. She froze, hand tightening on her flashlight. The beam cut forward, trembling faintly as it tried to pierce the white shroud. The shape grew larger. Her mind, grasping for logic, offered the most likely explanation: an elk, maybe, or a wandering moose driven down from the higher ridges. She braced herself for the arch of antlers, the hulking body that might crash through the fence. But the movement was wrong. Too deliberate. Too heavy. Each step pressed down as though the creature carried a weight behind it. She narrowed her eyes. The shape was dragging something. Her pulse quickened. One hand drifted to the pistol at her hip, not drawn, but ready. She angled the flashlight more firmly. The fog parted enough for her to see. It was a horse, a massive stallion, black as coal, its coat matted with clumps of ice and streaks of mud. The mane hung wild across its neck, tangled and stiff. Its body bore scars, long pale lines, crossing its shoulders, ribs, flanks, the kind of marks left not by nature, but by steel. The animal moved with labored strength, every muscle quivering from exhaustion. Yet its head was held high, eyes burning with a startling clarity. Behind it, dragging along the snow, was a canvas sack. The fabric was torn and soaked through, leaving a dark trail that stretched back into the trees. The sack looked heavy, lopsided, as though something more than rocks or branches lay within. Claire's mouth went dry. She had seen wild mustangs before, distant herds roaming the high plains, but never one like this. Never a horse that walked straight to a human outpost, burden, dragging gaze locked forward, as if it had chosen its destination. The stallion halted at the edge of the porch. For a long moment it stood completely still, chest heaving, steam rising from its nostrils in thick, white plumes. Snowflakes clung to the hair around its muzzle. Its eyes caught the lantern light, glinting with an intensity that rooted her to the spot. Then, without warning, the animal lowered its head. Slowly, with a deliberate motion that sent a shiver up her spine, the stallion bent its front legs. Its knees touched the snow, its body folding down until it knelt before her. The sack slid forward onto the porch steps with a wet thump. Claire inhaled sharply. Horses did not kneel. Not like this. The stallion lifted its head just enough to meet her eyes. The look was not feral, not panicked. It was imploring. There was no mistaking it, the animal was begging. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. The air between them seemed to thrum with something larger than instinct. It was as if the forest itself had sent an emissary to her door demanding witness. Claire gripped the flashlight tighter, her breath quickening. She could feel her pulse in her throat. The stallion did not move again. It stayed on its knees, chest, heaving eyes locked onto hers with unwavering intensity. She whispered to herself, almost inaudible in the cold air, "What in God's name?" For the first time in years, Claire Dawson, soldier ranger woman who had walked battlefields and outlasted storms, felt a sharp spike of awe that bordered on fear. She knew with a certainty that tightened her chest that this was no accident of nature. The wild had come to her door with a plea, and she was the only one to answer. Claire remained frozen on the porch, breath clouding in front of her, the beam of her flashlight trembling faintly in her grip. The black horse did not rise. It stayed on its knees, chest, pumping in shallow bursts, steam rolling from its nostrils. The torn sack rested at the edge of the porch wet canvas, spreading like a dark stain against the pale wood. The night around them seemed to fold in tighter, the fog pressing close, as though the entire forest waited to see what she would do. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She had faced armed men before, had walked patrols where every step could trigger an explosion. But nothing in her training had prepared her for this, a wild animal, kneeling as though in supplication, as though demanding she look inside that sack. Claire's gaze flicked from the horse to the bundle. Mud and half-frozen slush clung to the fabric, and the knot at the top frayed but stubborn. The bag was heavy enough to have carved a trench in the snow from the tree line all the way to the station steps. Whatever lay inside it was no scrap of trash scavenged from a dump. Her fingers tightened on the flashlight, then loosened again. Slowly, deliberately, she holstered the light, tugged off her glove with her teeth, and slid her bare hand back into the thick leather. Her breath came shallow. "All right," she murmured under her breath, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Let's see what you've brought me." She crouched, boots creaking on the wooden boards. Her gloved hands reached for the knot. For a moment she hesitated, struck by the surreal weight of the scene, a scarred horse, kneeling fog, curling like smoke, her own heart hammering like it had on combat tours years ago. Then she gritted her teeth and pulled. The rope gave way. The canvas sagged open, and at once the night filled with a metallic tang of blood. The smell was sharp, iron-rich, mingled with the rank stench of rust and damp fur. Claire recoiled instinctively, her throat tightening, but forced herself to peer inside. She had expected perhaps a carcass, maybe a deer cut down by poachers dragged here by some unfathomable instinct. But what she saw instead jolted her so hard her knees nearly gave. Curled in the bottom of the sack was a wolf pup. Its coat should have been the proud silver gray of the northern timber wolf, but now it was patchy, ragged, with bald spots matted with dried blood and mud. Its body was alarmingly thin ribs, pushing sharp ridges against the skin. One hind leg was mangled, shredded by the cruel bite of a steel trap. Claire could see the curved impression of the jaws still etched into the flesh, a grotesque signature of man's cruelty. The pup's chest rose in tiny jerks, each breath so faint she almost doubted it. A soft whimper escaped more vibration than sound, and its dull eyes fluttered open. For one fragile second they locked with hers. Not in fear, not in defiance, simply in recognition. Then the lid slid shut again, as though the effort had drained its last strength. Claire's throat constricted. She reached instinctively into the bag, pressing 2 fingers to the pup's side. The heartbeat she felt was faint, erratic, like a dying drum. She sucked in a sharp breath. Behind her, the horse shifted. She glanced up to see it step forward. The porch boards groaned under its massive weight. Steam billowed from its muzzle, and then it gave a sound that cut straight through her, half-nicker, half-groan, a low guttural cry that reverberated in the fog. The stallion's eyes flared amber, catching the lantern glow, and it fixed her with a gaze so fierce, so insistent, it made her chest tighten. It wasn't rage. It wasn't fear. It was something closer to demand. The message rang clear in her bones. Save it. Her lips parted, breath coming faster. For a wild moment, she thought she might be hallucinating, projecting meaning where there was none. But deep down, she knew. This was no dumb reaction of prey or predator. This horse understood. and it would not have dragged this bundle miles through the winter forest just to leave death at her doorstep. Claire rocked back on her heels, mind racing. The law was clear. Rangers were forbidden to keep or personally treat wild animals. Injured wildlife had to be reported immediately, then transferred to state-certified rescue centers. It was protocol drilled into every briefing, written into every manual. But she knew the nearest facility was over 3 hours away by snow-packed roads. Even if she called now, even if a transport was dispatched immediately, this pup would never survive the journey. Its heartbeat was already a flickering flame. By the time it reached official hands, that flame would be out. The logic snapped at her like a whip. Follow the law, and you guarantee its death. Break the law, and you give it a chance. Her military past came flooding back unbidden. Faces of comrades who had bled out waiting for medevac. The weight of bodies carried under gunfire because someone had whispered, "Don't leave me." The sound of promises she couldn't always keep. Her training had always warned her, don't get attached, don't cross the line between duty and feeling. But now, kneeling on the porch of a frozen ranger station, staring at a wolf pup delivered by a wild stallion, she felt something rise sharp and unshakable inside her. If she turned away, she wouldn't just be letting an animal die. She'd be betraying the oath she had sworn when she chose this life, to protect the wilderness, to be its steward. She looked again at the horse. Its chest heaved breath, gusting out in white plumes. Its eyes burned into hers. The forest had brought her a test. Her jaw tightened. "Damn it," she whispered. She slipped both hands into the sack, cradling the pup as carefully as if it were made of glass. The tiny body twitched a weak tremor, as though recognizing warmth. The temperature of its skin shocked her fever-hot around the wound, icy cold everywhere else. She pressed it against her chest, close under her coat, feeling the fragile flutter of its breaths against her ribs. The horse released a sound that might have been a sigh. Slowly, as if shedding an unbearable weight, it pushed itself up from its knees. Snow scattered from its legs. Its massive head dipped once, and the fire in its gaze softened just slightly into something like relief. Claire met its eyes. "All right," she said aloud, voice hushed but firm. "I'll save it." She rose to her feet, clutching the pup tight. The horse fell into step beside her instantly, muscles still trembling from exhaustion, yet its stride deliberate. Each heavy hoof landed just behind her boot, as if promising not to let her take another step alone. Together, they moved toward the door of the ranger station, fog curling at their backs. Inside, warmth and light awaited. Behind them, the forest exhaled, the stillness breaking as though acknowledging the choice that had been made. Claire did not look back. She didn't need to. Storm, the name had not yet been spoken, but already it lived in her mind, walked silently at her side. And for the first time that night, she felt the ice around her chest crack, replaced by the faintest spark of something far stronger than fear. Hope. Claire pushed the doors shut with her shoulder, the battered wolf pup cradled against her chest. The warmth of the station enveloped her at once, though it was hardly more than a drafty cabin with a stove in the corner. Still, compared to the freezing night outside, the air felt almost heavy. She laid the pup on the wooden table near the window, her fingers trembling as she tried to keep the tiny body steady. Its breathing rasped weakly, the shallow rise and fall, making her stomach twist. "Maria." Her voice cracked louder than she intended. "Maria, get in here." From the side room came hurried footsteps. Maria Lopez burst through the doorway, her dark hair tied in a quick braid, sleeves rolled past her elbows. At 25, she had the energy of someone new to the service, eager, stubborn, full of purpose. She froze for a heartbeat when she saw what lay on the table. Holy. She caught herself, eyes widening. Is that a wolf pup? Claire cut in, already pulling her gloves off. It's half dead. We need supplies. Cloth. Warmth. Now. The shock faded from Maria's face, almost instantly replaced by focus. She darted to the wall, flicked the lights brighter, then rushed to the storage cabinet. I'll call Emily, she said quickly, grabbing a blanket with one hand while fumbling her phone out with the other. She'll know what to do. Claire stroked the pup's head, her palm covering nearly the entire skull. The fur was damp, sticky with dried blood, the body beneath frighteningly light. The pup whimpered, eyes rolling slightly, then slumped back into stillness. Maria's voice carried from the corner, urgent and fast. Emily, it's Maria Lopez at the station. We've got a wolf pup badly injured. Trap wound, blood loss. We need you here immediately. Please. She paused, listening, then nodded vigorously, even though Emily couldn't see her. Yes. 20 minutes. Okay, hurry. She hung up breathless and looked at Claire. She's on her way. 20 minutes. 20 minutes, Claire echoed, staring down at the limp body. That's longer than it looks like he has. They didn't waste a second. Maria yanked the red infrared lamp from the corner and plugged it in, angling it so its glow washed over the table. Claire helped her wrap the pup in thick flannel, tucking the edges under to trap any shred of heat. She could feel the body shivering faintly under the layers, an uneven rhythm that made her press harder, as if her hands alone could keep him tethered to life. Mariah returned with a mug of warm water. She stirred sugar into it, testing it against her wrist, then pulled a small syringe from the first aid kit. Open his mouth just a little. Claire pried gently, her fingers dwarfed by the wolf's fragile muzzle. Mariah dripped the water in one careful drop at a time. Most of it trickled out, but some slid down his throat. The pup coughed faintly, a thin whimper escaping. That's it, little one. Maria whispered, her eyes wide with hope. Claire examined the wound on the hind leg. Her stomach clenched. The trap had torn through deep muscle, leaving a jagged gash packed with dirt and rust. The edges were swollen, angry red, the flesh hot despite the pup's otherwise chilled body. She pulled a strip of clean gauze and pressed it firmly against the wound, trying to stem the slow seep of blood. Stay with me, she muttered. Just stay with me. The seconds dragged like hours. Every breath the pup took was a victory. Every pause felt like a defeat. The room was silent but for the low hum of the lamp and the faint scrape of cloth as they worked. At the doorway, a shadow loomed. Claire glanced up and felt her heart lurch. The black stallion stood just outside, filling the frame. His massive head lowered, eyes fixed unblinking on the pup on the table. The lamplight threw his silhouette across the floorboards, a dark sentinel watching with unnerving stillness. He didn't stamp or wander. He didn't even shake the snow from his coat. He simply stood there, ears forward, nostrils flaring each time the pup whimpered. Every shallow gasp drew a twitch in his ears. Every faint cry pulled a rumbling snort from his chest, as if he were answering in kind. Maria followed Claire's gaze, whispering, "He hasn't moved since you came in. It's like..." Her voice trailed off. Claire didn't answer. She couldn't. There was a tightness in her chest. She couldn't name something between awe and disbelief. The horse seemed to understand more than understand. It was as if he carried the weight of the pup's life himself. The animal's presence filled the room even from outside. And for a moment, Claire had the strange sensation that she was not the only guardian here. The slam of a car door outside broke the silence. Moments later, quick boots crunched over snow. The door banged open, and Emily Hart strode in, her coat flaring behind her. At 28, Emily was younger than Claire, but carried herself with the calm authority of someone who had already spent years staring down emergencies. Her chestnut hair was bound back through strands clung to her damp forehead. A stethoscope swung from her neck, and her satchel bulged with supplies. She dropped the bag onto the floor, snapped on a pair of gloves, and approached the table. Her eyes darted over the pup with a sharp clinical sweep. "Hypothermia," she muttered, touching the pup's stomach. "Severe blood loss, malnutrition, and that leg, Jesus." She straightened her voice firm. "More heat. Keep the blankets tight. Maria, prepare a line. Claire, hold him steady." Claire obeyed without hesitation, cupping the pup's fragile torso in her palms. She felt the tiny ribs fluttering against her skin. Maria dug into Emily's kit, fumbling but quick, pulling out IV tubing and saline. Emily worked fast, inserting the needle with practiced precision, then taping it down against the thin foreleg. She checked the pupils, her brow furrowing. Unresponsive, but not gone. "He's clinging," her tone sharpened. "Mask. Oxygen." Maria hesitated. "We don't have one small enough, improvise," Emily snapped. Maria's eyes darted, then landed on a pediatric mask in the supply crate. She grabbed scissors, trimmed the rubber edges, and slipped it over the pup's muzzle. The hiss of oxygen filled the room, a faint, steady whisper. The station transformed into a field hospital. Gauze tubes, heat packs. The air stank of antiseptic and wet fur. Claire's hands ached from holding steady, but she refused to let go. Emily bent close, eyes sharp, giving clipped instructions that Maria scrambled to meet. For long minutes, the only sounds were the hiss of oxygen, the click of scissors, the rasping breaths of a pup, balanced on the edge of death. Then the pup jerked a small convulsion, rippling through his frame. The stallion outside reacted instantly. His chest expanded with a rough exhale, a guttural noise that vibrated against the porch walls. The windows rattled faintly. His ears pinned back, then forward again, head tossing once in agitation. Maria startled, glancing toward the door. Her gaze lingered on the massive silhouette. She leaned toward Claire, her whispers urgent. "That horse." She swallowed. He knows. He knows exactly what's happening." Claire didn't look away from the pup. Her lips pressed tight, then she gave the faintest nod. She had felt it too. The line between man and beast seemed to blur to nothing, as though some silent current connected them all. For a heartbeat, even Emily paused, her eyes flicking to the door before hardening again. She bent back over her patient. "Focus," she said tersely. But there was a tremor in her voice that hadn't been there before. Time lost its shape. Outside, the wind keened through the trees. Inside, the station glowed bright as noon, every lamp burning shadows thrown long across the walls. Word spread quickly through the ranger barracks. Someone must have seen Emily arrive, must have glimpsed the strange horse keeping vigil by the door. Whispers traveled faster than radio waves. Claire Dawson and Maria Lopez were inside, saving a wolf pup. And with them, watching like a sentinel, was a colossal black horse that refused to leave. One by one, the curious came. Not openly, not loudly, but with hesitant knocks at the door. They brought what they could: an old quilt folded neatly, a thermos of warm milk, scraps of food from the mess hall. They left them quietly, eyes lingering on the strange tableau before slipping away. Claire noticed, but didn't stop them. She had no energy for protocol, no will to argue. When she saw the honesty in their faces, the same unspoken conviction she felt in her own chest, she only accepted silent and returned to the pup. Hours bled into one another. Finally, the frantic pace steadied. The pup's breathing grew less erratic. The oxygen hissed evenly, the tiny chest rising with fragile rhythm. Emily slumped back, running a sleeve across her damp forehead. "He's not out of danger," she said quietly. but he's stable. For now. The relief that washed through the room was nearly palpable. Maria exhaled shakily, her shoulders sagging. Claire kept her hands on the pup, unwilling to let go. At the door, the stallion released a long, slow breath, his head lowering, muscles easing. He shifted his weight, settling like a guard, standing down for the first time all night. One of the younger rangers, standing just outside with the quilt still in his arms, whispered without meaning to be heard, "He looks like he walked straight out of a storm." The words floated through the doorway. Another ranger repeated them softly. Then another. Soon the name was passing between lips, like a spark catching dry tinder. Storm. Claire heard it. At first, she said nothing. She lifted her head, meeting the stallion's dark gaze through the doorway. His eyes, deep and burning, met hers steadily. And she realized the name fit. Storm, wild, scarred, relentless, but also the bearer of something fragile, something worth protecting. She didn't speak the word aloud, not yet. But when Maria, exhausted, leaned against the wall and murmured, "Storm kept that pup alive long enough for us to try," Claire only nodded. From that night onward, no one at the station called him the horse again. He was Storm. The storm-gray light of dawn filtered through the fog the next morning, faint and pale, turning the snow into a flat wash of white. By then, the pup had survived the night barely. Emily had stayed until the small hours, returning home only when she was confident that the IV drip was stable. Maria had fallen asleep in a chair chin, resting on her chest, still in her boots. Claire hadn't slept at all. She sat on the edge of the table, one hand resting on the bundle of blankets where the pup lay, her eyes burning with exhaustion, but sharp with vigilance. Storm stood outside the door, unmoving. Every now and then, Claire would hear the heavy sound of his breath or the slow scrape of a hoof on the porch. He hadn't left his post all night, and the knowledge steadied her more than coffee ever could. But word traveled faster than dawn. By mid-morning, Sheriff Jack Boone's truck crunched up the frozen drive. Claire heard it before she saw it in the low rumble of the engine cutting through the muffled quiet. She rose, her stomach tightening. Maria stirred awake as the door slammed outside, boots striking the snow with heavy finality. The sound alone announced Boone's presence, a man who made sure people knew when he'd arrived. He stepped inside without knocking, broad shoulders filling the doorway. Boone was in his mid-40s, built like a man who had thrown bales of hay before he ever wore a badge. His face was square, his jaw perpetually clenched, and his eyes cold. Narrow, hard, swept the room with authority that brooked no argument. He brushed snow off his coat with quick, dismissive movements, then stopped when his gaze landed on the bundle of blankets. "What in hell is this?" His voice was gravel sharp enough to cut. Claire straightened. An injured wolf pup. Found at the station last night. Boone's brow furrowed deep lines, creasing his forehead. He stepped closer, boots echoing against the wood. "This is a ranger station, Dawson, not a damn animal shelter." His eyes snapped to hers, cold fire behind them. "The law is clear. Any injured wildlife goes straight to the State Rescue Center. You don't keep it here. You don't play doctor. You follow procedure." His words landed like hammer blows. Maria flinched and lowered her gaze, biting her lip. Emily, who had returned quietly only minutes earlier, kept her focus on the pup, adjusting the IV line, as though Boone weren't in the room at all. The silence that followed was taut, as if the very walls of the cabin absorbed the weight of his authority. One of the younger rangers, who had wandered in with curiosity, cleared his throat nervously. "Sheriff's right. That's the rule, Claire. We're supposed to report and transfer. Otherwise, it's on us if something goes wrong." He spoke quietly, but the words were firm, rehearsed, like lines from a handbook. Another ranger nodded in agreement, shifting uncomfortably. It sounded reasonable. By the book. But their eyes betrayed them. Each glance slid toward the doorway where Storm stood like a statue, his massive frame dark against the morning fog. He hadn't moved, hadn't looked away. His amber eyes were locked on the pup, as if the world beyond that fragile life didn't exist. Claire felt the weight of Boone's gaze pressing down on her, demanding she bend, demanding she obey. Not everyone bent. The night before, when word spread through the station, more than one ranger had slipped blankets, milk, and scraps of food to the infirmary door. Now those same young men and women hovered in the hall, silent but watchful. They didn't step forward, not with Boone in the room, but their presence was a quiet vote. One of them, a lanky recruit, whose name Claire only half remembered, muttered under his breath, "If it weren't for that horse, the pup would have frozen to death out there." The words were almost swallowed by the floorboards, but Claire heard. So did Boone. His eyes cut sharply to the ranger, but the boy quickly looked away. Still, the truth of it hung in the air. The image of Storm standing sentinel, dragging the sack through the snow, kneeling as though begging everyone who had seen it, everyone who had heard it retold, felt it settle into their bones. No regulation could scrub that from memory. The room split itself down the middle. On one side, Boone's voice, reinforced by the murmured agreement of a few rangers who feared paperwork and reprimands, insisted on protocol. They spoke of chain of command, of liability, of the dangers of setting a precedent. On the other, the silence of those who couldn't bring themselves to voice support, but whose eyes lingered on the pup with quiet ache. Their hearts rebelled even if their tongues didn't. Compassion doesn't need volume to be felt. It vibrates in posture, in lowered eyes, in the way bodies lean slightly closer to one another. The air grew heavy, saturated with unspoken tension. Words tangled with glances. Footsteps shuffled nervously. The very stove seemed to tick louder in the stillness. It was a room divided. Claire knew the moment would break one way or another. She stepped forward, placing herself between Boone and the pup. Her shoulders squared, her jaws set. "You want to know what happened?" Her voice was steady low, but it carried to every corner. Boone's eyes narrowed. Last night, that horse, she jabbed a finger toward the doorway where Storm loomed, came out of the fog dragging this pup in a sack. He walked straight to this station. And then he knelt, Sheriff. He knelt in the snow and looked me dead in the eye. I don't care what your books say, there's not a manual in this country that explains that. That wasn't instinct. That was a plea. Her voice hardened, cut with steel. If I'd turned my back, that pup would have died right there on our porch. And I'll tell you this plain, Sheriff, that is not why I wear this uniform. Her words cracked through the tension like a rifle shot. The murmurs stopped. One ranger shifted, looking down at his boots. Another exhaled slowly, eyes flicking to the pup. Emily looked up briefly, her face unreadable, but her gaze steady on Claire. From the doorway, Storm tossed his head mane flying and struck his hoof against the porch with a sharp crack. The sound reverberated through the cabin like punctuation to Claire's declaration. For a moment, even Boone faltered. The silence stretched, heavy and brittle. Boone's jaw worked as though he chewed on the words he wanted to spit back. His eyes narrowed further, then he exhaled sharply through his nose. You're walking a fine line, Dawson. His voice was low, dangerous. You're bending rules that weren't meant to bend. One step further and you'll answer for it. He turned abruptly, his coat flaring as he strode out the door. The snow crunched loudly beneath his boots, a harsh rhythm that faded as he moved toward his truck. A door slammed, the engine roared to life, and then the sound receded into the fog. The cabin remained still. Mariah let out a long, shaky breath, her hand pressed to her chest. Emily bent back over the pup, her silence speaking volumes. She hadn't stopped working even once. But the set of her jaw was tighter now. Claire didn't move. She stared through the window, where Storm stood, his massive chest rising and falling, steam curling from his nostrils. He had not flinched during the entire confrontation, not once looked away. And in that moment, Claire knew she was not alone in the fight. Storm wasn't just a horse. He was an ally, a sentinel in the shape of the wild. The morning broke gray and muffled the fog, hanging heavier than usual over the treetops. Claire stepped into the narrow stall the rangers had rigged in the corner of the station, checking on the pup. He was breathing shallowly, but more evenly than before. Emily's treatments had steadied him, though survival was still not guaranteed. Claire brushed a hand along the blankets, listening to the faint rhythm of life beneath, when a sudden noise cut through the quiet. A whinny. Not the casual sound of a horse shifting or calling, but sharp and urgent. It rang through the yard, reverberating against the cabin walls like a horn. Claire stiffened, spinning toward the window. Storm. The stallion was out in the snow, his massive body-tense nostrils flared white in the cold. He threw his head back and cried out again, the sound raw and insistent. His hooves struck the ground, stamping hard enough to shake snow from the porch railing. His amber eyes fixed on Claire through the glass, fierce and unblinking. Claire hurried out, coat flapping against her legs. The air slapped her face with bitter cold, her breath turning to steam. Storm stood, rigid ears pricked forward, his whole frame vibrating with urgency. What is it? Claire demanded, though, and the question was more reflex than belief. Storm pawed the ground, then swung his head toward the forest. He let out another cry, then turned, took several heavy steps toward the tree line and stopped. His neck arched back to look at her, eyes blazing. Maria appeared behind Claire, rubbing sleep from her eyes, her hair pulled messily into a braid. "What's going on?" Claire didn't answer immediately. Storm cried out again, stamping, then trotted a few paces into the fog before halting, glancing back at them. Maria frowned, her voice hushed. "He wants us to follow." Claire felt her gut twist with certainty. Yes, that was exactly what he wanted. She grabbed her belt, fastening the holster and pistol at her hip. Her flashlight clipped to her jacket beam, testing the fog. Mariah slung a small medical kit over her shoulder, stuffing gauze and antiseptic inside with trembling hands. Storm waited, pawing the earth, his body tense as a bowstring. "All right," Claire muttered. She gave Maria a firm nod. "We follow, but stay sharp." They set off, boots crunching in the frozen crust. Storm led with long strides, his hooves sinking deep, but steady tail lashing. He did not gallop or flee, but moved with a measured urgency, glancing back every few yards to ensure they followed. His breath puffed out in great white clouds, joining the fog, as though the stallion himself exhaled the storm. The forest swallowed them quickly. Snow-laden branches arched overhead, heavy and creaking. Every step snapped twigs hidden under the drifts. Wind whispered like a voice through the trees. The deeper they went, the darker it felt, though daylight pressed somewhere above the fog. Claire's instincts prickled. This was no casual wander. Storm was leading them with intention, his path direct, his pauses calculated. Mariah stumbled on a root, catching herself on a trunk. "Where is he taking us?" Claire shook her head. "Wherever he came from, maybe. Somewhere he needs us to see." The words hung and neither woman dared fill the silence. Storm pressed on ears, flicking at unseen sounds. Every few minutes he stopped, waited for them to catch up, then moved again. His urgency never waned. The air grew heavier as they descended into a shallow gully. The snow here was churned oddly, the ground uneven, as though disturbed by more than deer hooves. Claire slowed, unease crawling into her stomach. Storm halted. He whinnied low, then stomped the ground hard enough to scatter snow. His eyes cut to a dense thicket of spruce. Claire stepped forward, pushing branches aside. Her stomach clenched. Iron glinted through frost. A steel trap sat half buried beneath the snow jaws, open rust coating its cruel teeth. Around it, the snow was stained dark brown, where blood had spilled and frozen into black ice. Claire's breath caught. Maria gasped, pressing a hand to her mouth. Oh my God. There wasn't just one. As Claire swept her light across the clearing, more shapes resolved. Dozens of traps scattered like a minefield, jaws waiting, some already sprung. Within them lay the proof bodies. A snowshoe hare limp and frozen, its fur matted with blood. A grouse stiff with death wings crumpled. 2 squirrels, one barely recognizable. And then movement. A young deer lay twisted on the ground, one leg caught fast in iron jaws. The creature kicked weakly, each motion feebler than the last, eyes wide and glassy with terror. Steam rose from its flanks, breath wheezing in thin clouds. Maria's voice cracked. Jesus, it's a slaughterhouse. Claire's throat tightened with rage. She moved quickly, pulling the wooden staff from her pack. She jammed it into the trap's mechanism and pried. Metal groaned, then released. The deer bolted weakly, stumbling on its wounded leg, before collapsing a few yards away. Claire knelt at its side, working quickly to bandage the gash with strips of cloth, her hands firm but gentle. The animal trembled but stilled as she worked, as though sensing her intent. Storm stood over them, his breath billowing, his eyes dark pools of memory. He pawed the snow near one of the traps, head lowering, ears pinned back. His entire frame radiated fury and pain. Claire looked up at him, and the realization struck like ice water. She studied his body properly for the first time. The long scars across his shoulder, the puckered marks near his chest, thin lines around his fetlocks that could only be left by steel. Her throat closed. "Maria," she whispered. Maria followed her gaze, eyes widening. Oh no. Claire swallowed hard, her mind spinning. Storm's scars weren't the marks of wild fights. They were wounds from these very traps. He had been caught before, brutalized, and somehow through strength or luck or sheer will escaped. No wonder he had dragged the pup to her. No wonder he stood at the doorway all night. He knew exactly what this pain was. He had lived it. Her chest ached with the revelation. Storm's story was written in his skin, and now he had brought them here to show them the truth. Claire rose, scanning the ground. The deer struggled to its feet, limped a few paces, then vanished into the trees. Around them, the forest was silent, but for the hiss of wind. She crouched near the trap, studying the churned snow. Deep boot prints marked the ground, wide and heavy. They led west, cutting a clear path through the drifts. Her eyes narrowed. A few torn scraps of burlap lay nearby, snagged on branches. She picked one up, rubbing it between her fingers. It was coarse-stained, torn in the same way as the sack Storm had dragged to the station. Her stomach knotted. The track stretched on, leading in a direction she knew well. Toward Frank Harlan's ranch. Claire's jaw tightened. Harlan, the wealthy horse breeder, respected in town, always boasting his stock at county fairs. But rumors had swirled for years that his ranch was a front, that he dabbled in the black market of hides and horns. No one had ever caught him. No one had dared. Maria bent close, voice hushed. Claire, if this is his doing. Claire cut her off, eyes burning. Then it's bigger than just one wolf pup. Storm's shifted muscles quivering, head turned toward the west. His ears were flat, his breathing ragged. He knew. Claire could see it in every line of him. She stepped closer, her hand brushing the long scar across his flank. The skin was rough-ridged, healed poorly. He flinched not from her touch, but from memory. Claire whispered, "You were his prisoner too, weren't you?" Storm didn't move, only stared into the trees where the trail led. His tail lashed once and then stilled. The silence between them was thick, an understanding deeper than words. Maria broke it softly. That's why he brought the pup. He knows. He remembers. Claire's jaw clenched. He's not just showing us where the traps are, he's telling us who's behind them. She stood tall, scanning the forest. The evidence was scattered at her feet, the traps, the dead animals, the burlap sacks, the boot prints pointing one undeniable way, and Storm bearing scars that testified to survival from the same cruelty. The pattern was clear. This wasn't about one injured wolf. It wasn't even about one horse. It was a network, a system of poaching, a quiet war against the forest itself. And Frank Harlan's name hung at the center like a shadow. Claire exhaled the cold air, burning her lungs. This isn't just about saving a life anymore. She said, her voice low but fierce. She glanced at Maria, then at Storm. It's about stopping a crime against the whole valley. Maria nodded hard, her hands trembling as she clutched the medical bag. Storm lifted his head, mane tossing in the cold breeze. He exhaled deeply, a sound more like a vow than breath. Snow swirled around his hooves as if the forest itself acknowledged his call. The secret was no longer hidden. It was awake. Snow fell in thin, dry flakes that morning, swirling like ash across the yard. The station felt tense, its walls heavy with the knowledge of what had been uncovered in the woods. Claire barely had time to sip her lukewarm coffee when the phone rang. The call was brief, clipped, bureaucratic. A message from the state forestry office delivered in the cold language of officials who had never knelt in snow beside a dying animal. The order was unmistakable. The wolf pup was to be surrendered within 24 hours and transferred to the State Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. No exceptions. A paper copy of the order arrived within hours, stamped with the state seal. Claire read it twice, her jaw tightening, then set it flat on the table. Around her, Maria and Emily exchanged anxious looks. Not long after, the crunch of tires broke the uneasy silence. Sheriff Boone's truck pulled into the yard, headlights glaring against the fog. He climbed out with the certainty of a man who had authority at his back. Two uniformed rangers stepped down from a second vehicle, their expressions unreadable. Boone stormed into the cabin, snow clinging to his boots. His eyes darted to the wolf pup curled in blankets near the stove, then snapped to Claire. "You've crossed the line," he said, voice like gravel. Orders came down from the state. That pup is to be transferred immediately. We're not running some backwoods clinic here. You know the law, Dawson. You don't get to bend it because you feel sorry for a half-dead predator. His words sliced through the air, sharp, unyielding. Maria flinched, but didn't speak. Emily adjusted the IV tube with steady hands, her silence louder than any protest. Boone took a step closer, his shadow looming over the table. "I'm warning you, Dawson. Refuse this order and you'll answer for it. You think your badge makes you special. It doesn't put you above the law." Claire's chest rose and fell slowly. She didn't look away. She knew this wasn't just a warning, it was an ultimatum. The door creaked open again before anyone could speak. Frank Harlan stepped inside. He looked out of place against the cabin's rough wood, dressed in a pressed coat and polished boots, his hair neatly combed back. His face wore the kind of smile that never reached the eyes, a smile practiced for business deals and handshakes. "Well," he said smoothly, "what a gathering. Sheriff, Rangers." He let his gaze linger on Claire. "And Miss Dawson." Claire's stomach turned. "What are you doing here, Harlan?" He spread his hands innocently. "Heard talk around town. Word travels fast. A black stallion wandering into your station, a wolf pup in tow. I came to see it with my own eyes. Curiosity, nothing more." His voice was light, but Claire saw the calculation behind it. Boone gave him a curt nod, almost respectful. "Frank's a respected man in this county, Dawson. He's here on his own, but it doesn't change the fact you're in violation." Harlan's eyes swept the room, resting briefly on the pup. "A wolf, is it, nasty creatures? But of course, nothing to do with me." His tone was a touch too polished, too quick to deny. And then Storm screamed. The stallion's cry tore through the cabin walls so sharp and furious, it made the glass panes tremble. Every head snapped toward the door. Storm stood in the yard, his muscles' rigid mane flaring in the wind. His ears pinned flat, his teeth bared, as he slammed a hoof into the frozen ground hard enough to splinter ice. His eyes burned red gold with recognition and fury. The horse surged forward to the porch, towering, his body vibrating with rage. His gaze locked on Harlan. Claire's breath caught. The stallion wasn't just restless. He knew. Harlan's confident smile flickered the mask, cracking, as sweat beaded at his temples. The room fell still, electrified by the animal's fury. Storm blocked the doorway, massive and unmovable, his every breath a warning. Claire spoke quietly, her voice carrying in the silence. "He remembers you." Harlan looked away, muttering something under his breath. Boone broke the tension with a snarl. "Enough!" He slammed his palm on the table. "This isn't about fairy tales or feelings. This is about law. Rangers are not here to decide the fate of wildlife. You have no right to keep that pup." He jabbed a finger at Claire, his voice rising. "You are sworn to enforce the law, Dawson, not rewrite it. And if you think hiding behind a horse and some bleeding hearts will save you, you're wrong." The two rangers with him shifted uneasily, eyes darting between Claire and Storm. They looked young, caught between obedience and conscience. Maria whispered urgently at Claire's shoulder, "If you fight this, they can suspend you. They'll take your badge." Emily finally lifted her head, her eyes sharp. "And if we hand him over now, he won't survive the trip. He's barely hanging on as it is." The pup whimpered faintly, as though adding his voice to the argument. Boone's glare hardened. "So what's it going to be, Dawson? Your career or a dying wolf?" The air grew so heavy, it seemed to crush the room itself. Claire moved. She stepped between the men and the small makeshift pen, her hand resting lightly on the wooden rail. Storm mirrored her, stepping forward until his body loomed beside her, his breath fogging the air. The horse's bulk radiated heat, his chest rising with the rhythm of a drumbeat. Claire's voice was low, each word deliberate. "If you want to take him, you'll have to go through us." The cabin froze. The fire cracked in the stove. The pup's breath rasped faintly in the silence. Boone's jaw clenched so tight, a vein pulsed in his temple. He took a single step forward, then stopped as Storm snapped his head high, letting out a scream that rattled the rafters. The sheriff flinched his boot, halting mid-step. The two young rangers at his side glanced at each other. One swallowed hard, then slowly he moved. He crossed the room and came to stand beside Claire. He said nothing, but his stance was answer enough. Another followed, then another, One by one, they formed a quiet line at Claire's back. Their faces were pale, but their eyes were steady. The balance shifted. Boone no longer faced one stubborn ranger and a furious horse. He faced a wall of his own men, silent but united. The sheriff's fury faltered. One of the rangers at his side cleared his throat nervously. "Sheriff, maybe we should think this through. The pup's too weak to move right now. Transferring him could kill him." "Shut your mouth." Boone snapped, his voice cracking with the strain. "You don't get to contradict orders." But the damage was done. The words hung reasonable and undeniable, fraying the authority he clung to. Harlan shifted uneasily, sweat shining on his forehead. Storm hadn't taken his eyes off him, pressing forward half a step, as though herding him back. The man actually recoiled, bumping into the wall before regaining composure. Boone's eyes darted across the room, taking in the faces, Maria's defiant tilt of chin, Emily's calm resistance, the silent rangers now arrayed against him. The horse's burning eyes fixed like judgment itself. For the first time, Sheriff Boone did not look in control. Finally, he exhaled a long, ragged breath, throwing up a hand. "You're making a mistake," he spat. "All of you." He turned his glare on Claire. "You're going too far, Dawson. I'll take this to the state office. We'll see what uniform you're wearing by the end of the week." He turned sharply, his boots striking hard against the wood. The door creaked as he yanked it open, the cold wind rushing in. Harlan hesitated, but Storm's piercing glare drove him back. He muttered something bitter under his breath and followed Boone out into the snow, his polished boots slipping slightly on the ice. The vehicles roared to life, engines fading into the distance, leaving only silence in their wake. Inside the station, the air felt thick with the weight of what had just happened. Maria sagged against the wall, exhaling. Emily returned to the pup, her hands steady but her lips pressed tight. The rangers who had stood beside Claire looked at her, their expressions wary but resolute, as if acknowledging that they had crossed a line they could never uncross. Storm shifted his breath loud in the quiet. He lowered his great head and pressed his muzzle gently against Claire's shoulder. The touch was warm, heavy grounding. She closed her eyes, her hand rising to rest against the stallion's scarred neck. A vow passed between them, wordless but ironclad. They would not yield. The fight was only beginning. The frost had not lifted when Clara Whitlow trudged up the path that wound past the ranger station. At 63, she had spent decades in Jackson Hollow, working part-time for the station as a laundry clerk. Her back was stooped, her hair silver, but her eyes remained keen, sharpened by a life of hardship and resilience. She carried a basket of folded uniforms against her hip, muttering about the cold. And then she stopped dead. There, in the pale wash of dawn, stood the black stallion. Storm was positioned at the edge of the porch, massive head bowed, his knees bent as though genuflecting. The rising sun caught the sheen of frost on his dark coat, scattering it into a halo of silver sparks. His amber eyes glowed with something that looked far too much like intention. Behind him, the small wolf pup whimpered in its pen, the weak sound barely audible. Clara's breath caught. "Mercy," she whispered to no one. Her fingers trembled as she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her old camera, a relic she never quite let go of. She lifted it, framed the stallion kneeling in the light, and clicked. The shutter cracked softly in the silence, capturing a moment that would carry far beyond this frozen valley. Later that day, her college-aged grandson uploaded the photo to social media. He added a single caption beneath it, "Even the wild asks for mercy." The black guardian of the forest. The image spread faster than snowmelt in spring. By the following morning, the local paper ran it across its front page. The Black Guardian of the Forest, beneath the headline. The photos showed Storm kneeling in the frost, his body colossal yet humble eyes burning. The article recounted whispers of the stallion bringing a dying wolf pup to the ranger's door. Television crews arrived soon after, parking vans at the gate. Cameras caught Storm pacing along the fence line, standing sentinel near the pup's pen, his breath steaming in the cold. Reporters spoke in reverent tones, retelling the tale with embellishments that grew by the hour. Some said the horse had prayed like a man. Others swore that tears had glimmered in his eyes. None could agree on the details, but all agreed on the symbol, a wild creature begging for compassion. The image was no longer just a photograph. It was a story carried on every tongue, a myth in the making. And then the people came. At first, a trickle, an elderly couple carrying wool blankets, explaining in hushed voices that they wanted the little wolf to stay warm. Then mothers arrived, their arms full of milk cartons and Tupperware packed with stew. Children brought crayon drawings of Storm and the wolf pup, taping them to the station's gate. In the crude shapes of horses and wolves and rainbows drawn over mountains, the message was clear: protect them. One morning, Claire heard a knock at the gate and found a boy waiting. He couldn't have been more than 10, thin as a reed, bundled in an oversized coat, cheeks pink from the cold. In his small hands, he held 2 wrinkled dollar bills. His voice shook as he looked up at her. "I came to help the little wolf," he said. "I don't have much, but maybe it can buy him food." Claire's throat closed. She crouched, taking the bills gently from his hand, as though they were sacred. "Thank you," she whispered. Behind her, Storm lowered his massive head until his muzzle touched the iron bars. The boy gasped, then laughed through sudden tears as the stallion's breath warmed his fingers. Cameras clicked nearby, capturing the image of a child, a horse, and a cause, bound together. By nightfall, the picture was everywhere. The tide of public pressure swelled. Phones rang off the hook in the regional forestry office. State officials fielded questions from newspapers, television anchors, even lawmakers. Why was the department threatening to seize a half-dead wolf pup from the care of rangers, and from the stallion the people now called Guardian? Behind closed doors, superiors debated furiously. A forced seizure now would destroy their reputation. Within days, a new directive was issued. The order to transfer the wolf pup was suspended pending investigation. The language was formal, sterile, but the truth was obvious. The people had spoken. At the ranger station, relief spread like warmth through thawing ice. Maria hugged Claire tightly, nearly lifting her off the ground. Emily allowed herself the faintest of smiles as she adjusted the pup's IV. Even the younger rangers, once torn, now stood straighter, their quiet rebellion justified. Storm stood on the porch main, tossing in the wind eyes, scanning the forest. He looked every bit the sentinel the people believed him to be. But Claire knew this wasn't the end. A reprieve for the pup did not erase the traps hidden in the snow. The animals already lost the shadow of Harlan's ranch looming over it all. So when Storm whinnied one cold morning, tossing his head toward the western trails, Claire was ready. She saddled her gear, called Maria, and beckoned 2 of the younger rangers who had stood with her during the standoff. They set out in silence, Storm leading. The stallion guided them through the forest with grim determination, hooves churning snow breath, pluming like smoke. The trail bent west toward land marked with Harlan's name. Hours later, they came upon a cluster of wooden sheds deep in the trees. The smell hit first-rank metallic sour. Claire pushed the door open. Inside, rows of pelts hung from rafters: wolf, fox, deer, coyote. Dozens stiff with cold, their lifeless eyes staring from frozen faces. In one corner, crates overflowed with antlers, bare claws, and tufts of fur tied into bundles. Maria gagged, turning away. The younger rangers swore under their breath. Claire's stomach clenched, fury rising in her chest. "This isn't just poaching," she whispered. "This is an operation." Storm bellowed a sound so deep it shook dust from the beams. His call echoed through the trees, a trumpet of accusation. They brought Boone with them the next day. The sheriff trudged through the snow reluctantly, his jaw set tight, but even he couldn't deny what the lanterns revealed inside the shed. His eyes moved over the pelts, the crates, the rusted traps stacked like tools of war. Harlan was dragged out from his ranch house, blustering protests. "You can't prove anything. That land isn't mine. It's leased. Those sheds, they were left there years ago." His voice cracked as evidence piled at his feet, burlap sacks identical to the ones Storm had carried, boot prints that matched his own documents tucked among the crates. Storm screamed when Harlan appeared. He reared hooves, striking the frozen air, mane flying. The stallion's fury was unrestrained, his body trembling with recognition. The younger rangers held their rifles tighter, unnerved not by the horse's rage, but by the truth it illuminated. Storm knew. Harlan's voice shrank beneath the weight of it. Sweat dripped from his brow despite the cold. One of his men tried to run but was caught, leaving behind more evidence, bloody gloves, snares hidden in packs. The network unraveled thread by thread, the picture undeniable. Boone stood back, his hands on his hips, his gaze torn between the horror before him and the stallion glaring fire at the poacher. For the first time, his certainty faltered. The group emerged into the cold afternoon, the sky a pale gray dome overhead. Harlan was shoved into a waiting vehicle, his protests drowned by Storm's furious cries. Silence settled, broken only by the creak of leather and the crunch of boots. Boone lingered near the shed, staring at the ground. His breath misted in the air, heavy with something like shame. At last, he turned to Claire. His voice, usually a hammer, came softer, weighed down. "You were right, Dawson." Claire blinked, surprised by the words. Boone's eyes found Storm, then dropped again. "I've been too rigid, too blind. All I saw was the law on the page. Meanwhile, this..." He gestured toward the shed, the crates of pelts, the rusted traps. His hand shook slightly. This was happening under our noses, and I was too damn stubborn to see it. The young rangers looked at him stunned. Boone's jaw flexed, then relaxed. "If it hadn't been for you and that horse, the forest would still be bleeding." Silence followed, heavy but cleansing. Claire felt Storm shift beside her. The stallion lowered his massive head, his amber eyes softening. For once his rage ebbed, replaced by a quiet calm, as though he too recognized the moment for what it was, the first true step toward justice. And in that silence, something changed. Boone was no longer an adversary. He was a man humbled, a man willing finally to listen. By the time the warrants were signed and Frank Harlan was driven away in a sheriff's truck, the sun had already bruised the horizon into a pale smear of gold and gray. The sheds were sealed. The traps tagged, the pelts cataloged under the unblinking gaze of cameras. Snow sifted down in thin threads, and if the sky were trying to cover the ugliness with something clean. The next day arrived with a promise, clear and cold. 2 boxy transport trucks rolled into the ranger yard just after dawn, tires biting through the frost. A state seal glinted on their doors. A team from the Yellowstone Wildlife Unit stepped out in fleece-lined jackets and wool caps, stamping their boots as they took stock. Emily Hart was already on the porch, hair tucked under a knit beanie, chart in hand. Maria hovered beside her with a clipboard, checking names, weights, sedatives, times. "Let's keep it calm," Emily said to the drivers. No sudden movements, no raised voices. We've snatched them back from the edge. We don't push them over it. She turned and caught Claire's eye. No speech passed between them, just the quick, steadying gravity of two people who had dragged a fragile thing through a storm and weren't about to drop it now. The first crate held a juvenile hawk that blinked at the light like it had forgotten the sky. The second was for a fawn whose stitched leg trembled but held. A fox went into the third tail, bandaged and stiff. Each box was padded with straw and old blankets, the ones townspeople had delivered through the weak, faded plaids, threadbare quilts, one with a stitched border of yellow daisies. At last, there was the small crate lined with a flannel shirt and a folded wool scarf. The pup lay curled inside Ivy, removed tiny chest, rising with a rhythm that would have seemed impossible 2 nights ago. His eyes opened when Emily lifted him. They were still clouded, but there was a pinprick of light in them, and it felt like a candle catching. Maria slipped her fingers inside the crate, and the pup pressed his muzzle to her knuckles. "Hey, soldier," she whispered. "Road trip." Emily set the crate on the tailgate, secured it, then stepped back so Claire could take one last look. The pup blinked at her slowly, as if recording her face for some future understanding. Claire reached in and brushed her thumb over his brow. "Hold fast," she murmured. "The world isn't as cruel as you were taught." Engines rumbled, ratchets clanked, paperwork shuffled across his hoods, and the chill air filled with radio squawks, routes, waypoints, arrival windows. Claire stood with her arms folded, resisting the useless urge to climb onto the truck and go with them. She glanced toward the porch. Storm stood there colossal and still mane-combed by the morning breeze. He had watched the entire operation without a step out of place. When the pup's crate shifted, his ears twitched. When the tailgates closed, his breath fogged heavier, as if he were adding his own kind of blessing. The drivers climbed into their cabs. Emily squeezed Claire's shoulder once, then jogged to the lead truck. Mariah lingered a heartbeat longer, eyes bright, and then she followed. The convoy pulled out, engines low and sure, rolling onto the road that wound toward the highway, then farther toward winter meadows and hidden dens, toward the long work of healing that could only happen away from the smell of iron. Claire stood at the edge of the porch until the trucks were no more than shadows in a pale haze. Her breath sank into the cold and came out as a prayer she didn't quite know how to speak. At least she said to no one they have a second chance. Snow whispered across the cleared patch of yard. The station felt larger when the trucks were gone and emptier for it. Claire turned. Storm's eyes met hers and held. "Come on," she said softly. "Let's make this a place worth guarding." People expected Storm to leave when the work was done. It was the logical ending. A midnight apparition returns to the wilderness, a myth reabsorbed by the trees. But the first morning after the convoy, when Claire opened the door with a coffee steaming in her hand, he was there on the porch boards, front hooves squared, head lifted to meet the new light. And the morning after that, and the morning after that. He did not join the corral with the rangers' horses. In fact, he barely acknowledged them beyond a courteous flick of an ear. He did not wander to the meadow or drink from the pond at the edge of the clearing unless Claire walked that way first. He did not sleep in the lean-to someone hastily constructed, though he inspected it and snorted like a foreman. Instead, he took up a post on the porch just off the path, where boot treads darkened the snow. At sunrise, he stood and watched Claire's shadow move back and forth through the cabin windows. At noon, he drifted toward the kitchen wall to listen to Maria's radio hum with songs and weather reports and gossip about an upcoming bake sale. When dusk peeled the color off the mountains, he lifted his head to track the last fox-bright stripe of sky, as if counting his watch to the second. In the dead of night, when the frost cracked like a pistol shot and the wind walked the ridge, he was a black shape against the pale boards. Breath-pluming ears, turning to the quiet, catching any sound that did not belong. Sheriff Boone came by once to deliver more paperwork and a rare apology. He took off his hat at the porch steps, turned it in his hands like a contrite schoolboy, and looked up into eyes that judged without malice. "Guess you won," Boone said to Claire later, which wasn't the truth, and Claire told him so. "No," she said. "We just listened to the right thing." Boone nodded at Storm before he left. It was the smallest gesture he had made in days, but it traveled a great distance. One afternoon, Claire found Storm facing the forest, motionless. She moved to stand beside him. The trees were quiet, no strange movement, no snap of steel. Just wind and snow and the occasional far-off call of a raven. "You could go," Claire said softly. "Nobody here would stop you." Storm did not move, but she felt him tilt toward her slightly, the way the earth tilts toward warmth every spring, whether it wants to or not. She realized then that his choosing was not a fluke of habit or hunger. It was not gratitude in the human sense. It was something more elemental, a creature deciding where to put his life. The morning of the vow was so quiet, the world sounded new. Fog lay in the low pockets washed in silver, and beyond it, the ridges were pale as bones. Claire stepped out into the cold and let it strike her fully nosed cheeks' lungs until she felt awake in the kind of way a warm room never allowed. Storm stood 10 feet away, a carved shadow against the lighter field. He had frost on the tips of his mane and at the edge of each ear. It glittered like someone had hung stars on him and then forgot to take them back. She walked to him slowly. He didn't turn his head because he didn't have to. He knew her steps. When she reached his shoulder, she set her palm against the heavy curtain of his mane. It was coarser than it looked, warm despite the cold, solid in a way that steadied everything else. She didn't intend to speak, but the words came as if they'd been waiting in her mouth a long time. "If you want," she said, and her voice shook only a little from today. "This is your home too." Storm lowered his head until his forehead met her sternum. He closed his eyes. The sound that left him was not a nicker or an exhale. It was a long, full-bellied sigh that vibrated through their bones. Acceptance, but not surrender. Agreement, not obligation. A line of belonging drawn in air. Claire pressed her cheek to the crest of his neck and let the cold sting her eyelids. No witnesses, no cameras, no signatures. Just a living weight and a human promise. And the sense that the forest had endorsed the contract with the silence of 1,000 needles. When Storm lifted his head again, the fog had thinned, and the first ribbon of sun slid down the slope to find them. The town spoke of arrests and charges of fines levied and licenses revoked. But those facts did not travel the way a story does. What people told in the diner over coffee and in the church hall after Sunday service, and in the small forge where a man hammered plow blades into new life, was this: a black horse had come out of the storm with a burden behind him and knelt at a human door. He had pleaded not with words, but with posture older than language. He had watched full of a fierce, careful love, while hands stitched and warmed and fed a creature that had no use to anybody but itself. He had led rangers into the woods like a guide across a dark river. And when the law shoved its fist through the door, that horse stood next to a woman and said, "No farther." Clara Whitlow's photograph hung over the counter at June's cafe. It was framed in simple oak Storm on his knees, the dawn threading his coat with light. People touched the frame as they passed without knowing they did. Children at the elementary school traced the line of the horse's neck with crayon and taped their pictures to the hallway walls. Someone with a knack for wood burning made a plaque that read, "The Black Guardian," and it appeared on the ranger station gate one morning with no note left behind. Ethan Miller, the boy with $2 bills and a courage larger than himself, stood between his mother and a reporter and spoke in the small, steady voice of someone who already understood the correct order of things. "The horse wanted help," he said. "So we helped." And so the name became less a nickname and more a title. Not Storm the anomaly, not Storm the stray. The Black Guardian of the forest. Not a fable exactly, because there were receipts and court dates to prove it happened, but something with a fable's endurance, the kind that passes from mouth to mouth and grows not in detail, but in meaning. It traveled outward. A school in the next valley sent a box of drawings. A rescue in Montana emailed to say they were naming a new foal guardian in honor of a story that was teaching their students to pay attention. A columnist from a distant city wrote that she had pinned the photo over her desk to remind her that mercy is sometimes the most radical kind of order. Claire read that piece late one night at the office computer and sat back, a hand covering her mouth. Outside, storms shifted on the porch, and the boards gave a soft, familiar groan. The station was never the same, not louder exactly, but fuller. The young rangers carried themselves with a quiet pride that came from choosing their ground. Maria learned how to make a decent hot chocolate for a horse who liked to nose her elbow until she laughed and told him to stop being ridiculous. Emily visited twice a week with updates from Yellowstone, the hawk taking short flights between perches, the fawn putting weight on the healed leg, the fox growing glossy. "And the pup, he sleeps a lot," Emily said, standing with her hip against the desk, a tired smile softening her eyes. "He eats like he's trying to make up for a lifetime. He growls at his reflection and then gets embarrassed and tries to look like he meant to do it." Claire listened the way a person listens to weather after a drought. "Does he? Does he seem afraid of humans?" Emily's smile tilted. "He seems to know the difference." On one of those afternoons, Boone lingered on the porch after dropping off recovered evidence for the attorneys. He stood beside Storm without flinching, and Storm allowed it. They watched the tree line in the companionable silence of men and beasts who had learned something the hard way. Boone cleared his throat. "I'll be straight with you, Dawson. For a while there, I thought the worst thing that could happen to the county was a ranger deciding which rules mattered." He tipped his hat back, eyes narrowed at a hawk speck in the sky. "Turns out the worst thing is when none of us remember why we made the rules in the first place." Claire said, "To protect what can't protect itself." He nodded once. "Keep doing that." He touched the brim of his hat toward Storm and left without another word. In the end, it wasn't the arrests or the confiscated hides that rewired the place. It was the shape of a horse on a porch at midnight, and the fact that a dozen people, then 100, then more, found themselves rearranged by it. Claire felt it most on the nights the wind took the valley to pieces and the station rattled in its joints. She would sit by the window with the lamp low and a blanket over her knees, radio murmuring the dull news of a world too large to comprehend, and look out at the dark. Storm would be there, a stillness she could measure her pulse against. Sometimes he would tilt an ear toward the glass, as if to say, "I know you're there." Sometimes she would whisper, even if he could not hear, and he would answer in the language they had learned together, presence. One night, with the moon clawing its way over the ridge and laying a pale river down the yard, she spoke aloud, because that was what the moment asked. "Guardian," she said, because that was his name now in her mouth and in the mouth of the town, and in the quiet ledger where the forest counts its debts. The word fogged the window and faded and fogged again. Guardian. Outside, the horse lifted his head and looked straight at the lamp, and his eyes caught the moon so that for an instant he shone. The wind dropped. The pines made their soft, endless sound. Somewhere far off, a wolf called the note thin and bright, utterly alive. It threaded the night and vanished. Claire closed her eyes and listened to the echo inside her of law that had bent toward mercy and found itself stronger for it, of a uniform that meant more after it had been tested, of a vow made with a touch on a mane and kept each day by standing one more hour in the cold. The legend did not end there. Of course it didn't. Legends do not end. They take up residence. They grow in the telling until they fit the shape of what people need. In Jackson Hollow, the story found the exact size of the town's heart. And on the porch of a small ranger station in a winter-struck valley, the Black Guardian kept his watch scarred and steadfast, a boundary where cruelty broke a reminder that sometimes the wild knocks on our door not to threaten, but to ask for the thing we are meant to give. We answer or we don't. The forest remembers either way. Claire stepped away from the window and opened the door. The cold slid in, honest and sharp. Storm turned his head, and the porch light laid a gold stripe along his cheek. She stood beside him, looking out where the dark softened at the edges, and for a long time, neither of them moved. This too was the work.
Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. We'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know your favorite part. If you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more captivating stories like this one. And don't miss out. Hit the notification bell so you're always updated on our latest content. Your support truly means the world to us.